Hi, Narrate. It's no secret we are in the midst of an election year. Now, what if we could engage in the upcoming election from a place of deep conviction, but in a way that is also kind, convicted, and therefore representative of Jesus' way of being human? Around Narrate, we're trying to take seriously both the calling and the opportunity to go about this year's election differently. We genuinely want to be a people who can disagree and yet remain friends. We also want to do our part to go about this year's election in a way which promotes community, not in a way which profits from division or preys upon inherent insecurities. With the above in mind, we would love for you to join us for Think Helena. This will be an event downtown from 6 to 9 p.m. on Friday, September 20th. We're going to start at 326 Fuller at 6 p.m., where we'll take part in a series of 5 Think Media Talks. There will also be live music and intentional hosting from some of the Narrate staff. At about 7:30, we'll head over to the Blackfoot for some post-event hanging out. The cost is $10 and seating is limited. Grab your tickets at 406 Tix today. We hope you'll join us.
They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what happened to the demoniac and the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed.
Nice work. Thank you. Good job. You can take that with you. So, it's great to be with you. I have a lot of goals for this morning, and I pride myself on not trying to accomplish too much. But there's just several different kind of conversations that I want to spark, or several different people I want to speak to. But it starts, well, first of all, I guess we name that what you've already picked up on is the first Sunday in October marks our 15th anniversary as a church. Some of you may remember, some not, that we held our very first gatherings the last Sunday in September of 2009. Then we did another one of June 2009, then July 2009, then August 2009. Then we took Labor Day weekend off, did 3 gatherings in September, and our grand opening was in the Cinemark on the first Sunday in October. But on the first Sunday of October around here, we're going to be busy in a series. I'm very excited for this series and the conversations, and Daniel as an exemplar of how we can live faithfully in this culture, but also be very present to it. And so I thought, let's just take this week and just celebrate this story. And there's several of you that I want to celebrate, but first I got to define some terms. We said from the very beginning that we wanted to be a church of owners, not members. And what we mean by that is this general kind of thing that members have privileges and owners have responsibilities. Part of the reason why we meet in a local church, and even things like Ales for Trails, they exemplify that our desire has always been to be the kind of place that involves a lot of people who buy into wanting to do the work, who want to gather and scatter and make coffee and do all of that. And it's not because we're trying to be curmudgeons with the budget, it's because we want to be this place of high buy-in. And so this value of ownership has been there from the very beginning. And so one of the things I want to do this morning is say thank you to those of you who have been owners, some of you going all the way back to 2009. Now, we define ownership specifically but loosely. It involves some variation of giving, being on a Sunday team, scattering with us. But I just want to ask this, and I know that nobody likes to raise their hand, but if you're someone who's been a part of this place since before COVID, like you're a part of that era, like 2009 to before COVID, and I'm not asking like you came to a service once, but I mean like you were a regular kind of owner at this place. How many of you go like, yeah, I was an owner pre-COVID? Will you just raise your hand? Because I just actually want to give you permission to look around and go like, whoa, there's a lot. And in this service, I thought this might happen. Because then, so that's awesome. Thank you. It's a big deal. It's hard to stay in relationship in contexts like this for that long. But then there's this other group that I also want to honor and thank you. I think we're here today because there was this group of people who invested heavily and gave mightily, and in some ways who are still here even though we went through these tumultuous waters called COVID. And yet part of what animated us in that season was we started to see this influx of those of you who've joined us since COVID. Those of you who have been, so let's ask the same question, like how many of you would say, yeah, I'm an owner around here? And again, we define that loosely, but it's really since COVID that this has become my community. Will you raise your hands? Come on, you're being bashful. Yeah, like it's awesome. Thank you. You've given us great energy. And then there's another group of you, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands because it's so horrible to do so, but there's another group of you, you're still checking us out. I'm of the conviction there's a lot of good churches in town. You're trying to figure out whether or not this is the right one for you. And part of what I want to do this morning is help you just understand the longer story. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. In fact, I remember years ago when I was doing student ministry, we took a group to a church, and it was clear that there were like 15 of us not from this town or this church. Remember this story? And someone from the platform's like, hey, if you're new here, raise your hand and we'll give you a coupon for a free cinnamon roll. And I still remember like looking down the aisle going, if you raise your hand, I'm going to kill you. So we're not going to do that to you. But there are a lot of you who you're in that season. And again, I'm hoping to serve you. And then, quite frankly, there's a fourth group of you. And in some ways, there's lots of overlap with this fourth one. Because part of the conversations I get to have are just like the current state of Narrate and where we're at. And I understand because I only like I only like change that I'm in control of. And I understand that for some of you, there's a lot of change and you don't feel in particular control of it, and that creates emotion, and it should. So there's another group of you who you're seeing the dynamic nature of Narrate, and there's parts of it that you like, and parts of it that you don't, and parts of it make you want to leave, and parts of it make you want to stay. And what I'm hoping happens for you this morning is, quite honestly, that part of what you'll see is built into our story is that by the grace of God, we've always been a dynamic community. That was intentional, but it was also, I think, something that happened in spite of us, by God's grace. Like there's always been a dynamic culture of change, and yet I'm hoping telling this story over a 15-year span will also help you to go, and there's this remarkable stability. Like it is dynamic, but there's actually tremendous stability, and the reason for that stability, I can't account for it mathematically and percentage-wise. It's God and it's you. Like, you've given it that stability. And so what I want to do is pray, and then we're just going to jump into the story. So God, we also honor you and recognize that this isn't ours, it's yours, and in senses that it's just impossible for us to conceive. Our lives aren't our own, they're yours. And so, God, thanks for letting us be a part of this journey, and we want to be stewards and not possessors, and trust you in the way you lead. Amen. So looking back to 2009, I couldn't have said this at the time, but we were planted. So if you don't know, we were planted by two churches, one in Bozeman, one in Billings, lots of relationship behind all of those. I worked at the one in Billings for almost 10 years. But we were planted in the midst of what is technically, and I think historically, what we call this debate between attractional and missional church. So let's define terms. Attractional church is what probably everyone in this room now takes for granted. It's an experience on a Sunday morning that you actually enjoy being a part of. It's an experience on Sunday morning that has something for you, whether you're a Christian or not. It's an experience where you understand the music and the vocabulary, and on some level you go like, oh, that was a good experience. Now, we take that for granted, but that was something that God and the Holy Spirit did in the 20th century, especially in the U.S. in this latest version. It started in California, it moved across the country, and that's very much been a part of the culture. But in the 1990s, and especially in the 2000s, what happened, because this is what 20-somethings do, is they deconstruct what they were given. And I would have been among those who started deconstructing this, and it started this what's called missional conversation. And what the missional conversation was saying is like, wait a minute, should we be attracting people to God by way of our lasers and lights and smoke and music and messages and free Walkmans back in the 90s? Or should it be by our service? By mattering to our local community, by like serving people. And it was a really big debate if you nerd out in those spaces. And I'm so grateful for one of my key influencers, is a guy named Vern, who is one of the most talented people I've ever known. And I have this clear memory of one day going for a walk with him when I was on staff at Harvest. The conversation for Narrate had started. I was in seminary. I was a 20-something idealist. It's not taking a shot at 20-something. It's just part of what it means to grow up. And I remember him saying, Adam, it's both. And he was just like stupefied that people couldn't understand it's both. Like we need places to do both. And I think that's where we started. We called it gathering and scattering, this value for let's create something that we'd be proud to invite our friends to, but then let's go serve the common good together. Well, before I left Billings, and you hear me reference this man often, he was a spiritual mentor to me, Fred Nelson. I thought I'd finally put his bald mug up on the screen. I met with him every other week since I was 20 years old, still meet with him on the phone, I think every 8 weeks. But one of the things Fred said to me before we left, and he's not a pastor, he's a retired insurance agent who has lots and lots of experience in ministry, and he said, Adam, I think the way this is going to go is that for the first couple years, you and everyone involved is going to wonder if it was the right thing. There's going to be a lot of anxiety around whether or not this is going to be successful, whether or not you're the right one, whether or not you should be doing this, whether or not they should stay. And then he said, and then I think after a couple years, things will start to roll. Now, when I heard that at the time, I mean, I don't think I'd have been qualified to do this if I'd have went like, okay, that sounds good. Like, of course I didn't. I was like, no, you're crazy. We're going to be 1,000 people by the end of the first year, just like our mother churches. And we weren't. And it was a hard go for those first years. Fun, and there was things happening, but no one would have confused us for something that was experiencing rapid growth. I remember it was in that same season, a couple of friends, my friends Steve and Mike took me to lunch, and they had a lot of voice with me at the time, especially because in many ways they embodied the person that we were trying to meet, which was, and reach, was with a person who wasn't necessarily closed to God, but had a lot of negative taste in their mouth around church. These were these two longtime businessmen in Helena, and I remember Steve saying to me, he said, Adam, if I could tell you the number of organizations, businesses, that have moved to Helena, dropped millions of dollars, and then left 2 years later with their tail between their legs, I would have lost count. And that was encouraging to me, because it was what I was experiencing. And those of us who have been here for a while now, we know that about Helena. Like, things don't scale here. They don't blow up. You can't just buy a brand. Like, it's still got kind of a small-time vibe. Like, nobody even trusts you. I just was at a thing yesterday, and they're like, are you from Helena? And the person's like, yeah. He's like, what year did you graduate? And he's like, well, I didn't know that was the defining term of being from Helena. Like, it's still part of the culture, and there's some great things about that. That carried us. And it was within that first 2 years that I was introduced to a book by Jim Collins called Great by Choice. Jim Collins is I think still teaches in Stanford Business School. I'd been influenced by him in grad school through a book called Good to Great. This book, Great by Choice, though, and I can't remember what prompted it. It was probably a Catalyst podcast or something. But I was reading it in this season, quite frankly, where it was still unclear whether or not we'd ever get into orbit as a church. And he lined some things out that really helped us. See, the question that he tackles in the book, and I highly recommend it, is why do some organizations get destroyed by chaos and others thrive? Of course, he was asking this way before some of what we've experienced more recently. And his answer is brilliant. I highly recommend it. I can't get into all of it, but the part that really resonated for us was what he calls the 20-mile march. He tells the story in there of two competing explorer groups, both of whom in the early 1900s committed themselves to being the first group to reach the South Pole. Both of them really had equal qualifications and resource, like those variables were easily removed from the equation. One of them won, the other one lost. One of them, their entire crew survived. The other one, the entire crew died on Antarctica. In fact, the crew that won beat the other one, even though they left, I think, on the same day, or maybe there was a one-day difference. They got there 20 days before the other. And the question he's asking is, what's the difference? Like, it wasn't about resource or technology or any of those things. What's the difference? And one of the observations that he made was one of the groups, they decided before their feet ever hit the ice that they were going to march according to the weather. And so on a day where, again, we're talking about Antarctica, so it's relative, but on a day where the weather was favorable, they might go 30 or 40 miles. And on a day when it wasn't, they might only go 5. And on a day that was particularly harsh, they may not leave their tents. The other group, they decided they were going 20 miles every day. Well, they didn't. They didn't get a vote. He decided. He decided, the leader, having sat with all the information, done the training, looked at the math, that the way to do this was they were going to do 20 miles every day, which means there were some days where the group was upset because it was so nice they certainly could have went 40 and they stopped early. And there were other days where it felt irresponsible to be outside of your tent and they still went 20. He called it the 20-mile march. And that for us, I think it's part of my temperament, I think it's part of Helena's culture, but that for us really made sense. And we started to put to words like, okay, the staff and the council worked really hard to go like, okay, so what's our 20-mile march? And frankly, it sounds easy now, but it was some work. It was just simply this. We're going to gather weekly, and we're going to scatter monthly. And we've stayed pretty true to that, except for this month, we're blowing up the scatter monthly because it feels like we're doing something every weekend. But it was just, we just decided we're just going to lock into this rhythm and trust the process. The other thing that he talks about, and we defined this, and I want to share these because I think this speaks to that. Yes, things are dynamic, and I think you'll see that we're still staying true to a recipe that we've been true to since 2010. Because the other thing he talks about is good organizations, they know their recipe. They know the things that they do and that they don't do, and they stick to it. So here's ours, and this is all but 2 of them have been in place since 2010. First, create Sunday experiences that challenge longtime followers of Jesus and unchurched, de-churched, and spiritually minded people equally. Let's create experiences that are helpful for everybody. 2, meet in public space. It's familiar for our guests. We like the value of this isn't our space, it's the community space. 3, stay portable. It elicits a culture of ownership, not membership, because we can't host a gathering without volunteerism and ownership. Number 4, stay downtown. It keeps us present. It just always felt clear to us that we were to be a downtown church. Number 5, create a culture of owners that value serving together on Sunday teams and at scattering events. In other words, what's more normative for church culture is people get so busy with Bible study and prayer groups and things like that when you go like, hey, we're going to go serve some people, they go, with what day? Like, I'm too busy studying the Bible. And it's not that we don't love studying the Bible, it's that we just observed that organizations, churches that thrive, they start with let's serve people together. That becomes the mechanism to build friendships, and it goes from there. Number 6, maintain a networking and relational staff. Meet over lunches and coffee. You all take for granted, perhaps, the availability of the staff to you, but it's not normal, and that's been a value of ours. 7, teach with questions. They make us real and approachable. My friend Mike came up to me after the first service. He's an atheist. We've talked a lot, and he said, keep asking questions. It's the only reason I'm here. Number 8, scatter monthly. Matter for the common good. That's, again, we don't, ALES isn't about getting people to church. Like there's a cultural commission in the Bible, and there's a great commission, and we've always tried to give them equal merit and value. Number 9, live with a high value of people. Fight for it daily. One of the legacies of the culture that planted us is a legacy where they weren't a bunch of cynical people who assumed the worst about people and just mostly were burnt and bitter. And you know how hard that is. I know how hard that is. It's easy to be a young, ambitious business leader, counselor, teacher, whatever, and think the best about those that you serve. It's really hard to do real estate for 30 years and not deep down just resent people. Number 10, network, collaborate, and scatter with individuals and organizations from different and unlikely sectors. Stay on the edge. We value a lot of the things that the Christian community does in Helena, but we've always said, like, we think mostly our role is in a different lane than that. We want to network with places like the Blackfoot and other organizations who maybe aren't often associated with church, but they do good work for the community. Number 11, invest heavily in mainstream advertising. Don't assume they know we're here, and stay hungry. This one sounds weird, but it's something we learned the hard way in those first couple years. We assumed do something great, well, people will find out about it. I think that's a half-truth, and we concluded that it was. Number 12, and this is new since COVID, help people find community. Faith is a team sport. We observed during COVID that part of where we failed was to help people with this. And number 13, create art that is aesthetically beautiful by non-church standards. I'm kind of an aesthetic. I think that's my mom's fault. And I would rather have no music than bad music and no art than bad art. And we just said, let's do good art. So this kind of carried us emotionally in the latter part of that second year. And then things, they didn't take off. But in that third year of being a church, there was this kind of head of steam, and we were starting to see results, and the room was starting to fill up, and there was other conversations that were starting to happen. And it was then that we invited a guy named Stan Simmons, who's still alive, even though it looks like an obituary picture, but I couldn't find a good one. Stan, I think you could argue, based upon certain metrics, that Stan's the most successful faith leader in the history of our state. He's built this remarkable church, and it's not remarkable just because it's big, but they just do such a good job. It's the church in Billings where I really owned my faith. It's where my wife owned her faith as a teenager. We were married at that church, and so we invited him in that third year to come. He was proud of us. We were proud to be associated with him. He came, he spoke, and I've not forgotten that was when I used to use this side of the room when we were sitting down there during one of the services, and he leaned over and he said, "Adam, this place can get as big as you want it to," which is very affirming. And we had follow-up meetings after that. We did some consulting with him. I knew what he meant, do the thing. And I want to be clear before I say another word on this. It's not a moral thing. I hold no judgment for churches that scale and get big and do capital campaigns. That's really not the point. It's about being true to vocation. What Stan meant was do the thing. Do the capital campaign, buy the land, build the building, turn that building into the kids' center, build another building, which was very affirming. And we were breaking the 80% rule. In the world of church, there's this hard and fast rule that if the room's 80% full, you're done growing. People will stop coming because it feels too full. We wrestled with that as a council and as a staff, and there was a lot of conversation that occurred around that, what do we do with this? We did explore options. We almost moved into the Helena Middle School auditorium at one point. We were the 1 yard line on that one. It fell through. But in that same time, I had developed this pretty meaningful friendship with a guy named Brian Smith, who is the owner of the Blackfoot. I'm sorry for all the beer references. I celebrate those of you in recovery, and those of you that aren't 21, I get this as a conflicting message. But also, it's a great organization. I got to learn from Brian because of doing ales with him. He's not a church guy. I don't know his spiritual convictions. He's a great guy and a brilliant business leader. And what I observed about the Blackfoot was, by all accounts, they should be scaling. And in particular, what I mean by that is, I learned that as early as 2010, Blackfoot sold every bit of beer that they made. They were maxed out in their production. By all accounts, they should have been packaging and selling it in the store. They should have opened a bigger tap room or more tap room. They could have done the McKenzie River thing. And if they had, that would have been okay. They could have had a brewery in every town. And part of it, actually, today, you look out at Helena and you see all these breweries. Brian has a lot to do with that. He made a conscious choice to not block it all. And again, it would have been okay if he did. I'm not judging that. But he just made this decision of we're going to be good at this. And I was the one that coined the phrase, from listening to him, the Blackfoot model. And what I mean by it is this. They made this very conscious choice that they weren't going to allow their success to sabotage their culture or the product that they wanted to create. And that carried us. We were still going against conventional wisdom. We still didn't know where that was going to lead. We were trying to stay faithful to that. And then COVID happened. The first Sunday in January of 2020, I don't know why this always makes me emotional. The first Sunday in January of 2020, our attendance was 523. So you can see we were kind of blowing up the 80% rule. We followed the government orders. We closed for 6 weeks. When we reopened, we were 33. Now, I want to be clear on this. We worked hard then, and I mean it now. We weren't judging anybody who wasn't here. Some of you were cautious, and some of you were accepting, and that's okay. But the reality was, we went from a church of 523 to a church of 33 and really 80-something in a span of 6 weeks. And it was dramatic. It was traumatic. It also raised these questions of like, can you imagine if we had a $10 million mortgage on a chunk of land out in the valley and the pressure that would have come with paying that? There's very little doubt in my mind that I would still be doing this had we done that. It was in that season, there was a book on my shelf that I'd owned, I don't know for how long, by David Brooks called Second Mountain, and I highly recommend it. David Brooks, who is himself a recent convert to Christianity, he tells this story that basically is comprised of all of us go on a journey to be successful. And sometimes the success we're chasing is, a house and a dog and the kids and all that stuff. And sometimes it's a particular academic pursuit. And sometimes it's a particular sport pursuit. And sometimes we get to the top of that mountain at 40, and sometimes we get to the top of that mountain at 16. But what he observes is there's this thing that happens in the lives of people where they start climbing this mountain, they get to the top of it, only to find it wildly unsatisfying. And this, he says, is when the wheels often fall off. We act out in ways that we don't understand at the time, but there's a minority of people, he says, who are self-aware, maybe it's a Holy Spirit thing, probably is, and they become self-aware that instead of just blowing it up, they pursue what he calls a second mountain. And the second mountain, he said, is comprised of some combination of these four things: a pursuit of family, a pursuit of community and friendship, a pursuit of God, and a pursuit of vocation. Let's just take the vocation one. It would mean that no longer is the interest in how much will I make if I do that, because that's found to be unsatisfying. And instead, the conversation becomes, God, this is your life. What do you want me to do with it? Just one of the examples. I think this book was the way I could emotionally make sense of what we were experiencing. Because in my little world, we had been successful, and it had been blown up. And what happened in the midst of that season, it's very complicated. There's lots of layers. This was not just me, it was the staff and many others. But what happened was this permission to go like, okay, so what matters? How do we find our way forward? What are we going to pursue? I don't know if you remember what you felt in that season, but I reached this point where I couldn't listen to any more podcasts, I couldn't read any more books, I could barely even have conversations with people because it was so complicated and so loud and so heated. And I remember, for reasons I don't remember why, I just made this decision in my own quiet times because I'm not here, I don't read the Bible because I'm here because I fell in love with reading the Bible, quite frankly, and with that God. And so I returned to this, I had developed this system where I'd read good books, you guys know, and I'd pull principles, and we'd do series, and I'd apply them personally, and that just didn't work for me in this season. And I remember I just decided, like, I'm going to just do this thing Fred taught me at 20 years old, which is get up in the morning, open to Matthew, start reading. When the Holy Spirit stops, hang out there. That's not to say every day is this like aha moment, but just go like sometimes these studies might last days and sometimes weeks. And personally, while we were kind of doing some triage on Sundays around here, I was just like locked into Matthew. None of my old tricks worked. And I remember it was after Easter that year, I came to the staff kind of with my tail between my leg, and I was like, guys, I don't have another series. I think I just have to teach Matthew. Just to kind of, I've created this paper trail behind myself. I think I just have to lead you through what I've done. And for so many months, it was so exhausting because every rule I was breaking, I knew I was breaking it. But we just started like reading through Matthew. And then we were like, well, you know what we should do? Like, we should have someone read Matthew, and then I'll teach it. So we started doing that. And then there was this like, wait a minute, you know what people can't do at home alone is they can't take communion. So we started taking communion. And then we had this moment of like, wait a minute, we are so innovative as we do things that the church has been doing for 2,000 years. And so this Matthew series became this very kind of wild season in my life and our life together, because as we were doing what I know how to do, which is innovate, I quickly started to learn, like, we're not innovating anything. We're just practicing ancient faith. And what was freeing about it, and again, we have to turn this corner a little bit now. It's not as true anymore. But there for a season, the only people in the room were people leaning forward into their faith who were engaged. And that's not to say that the people who weren't in the room weren't doing that, but you had no reason to be here unless you really wanted God. And that was so freeing as a staff. And it invited us to look through this beautiful, the great tradition, and go like, what tools might help us in this season? And so that's what we're trying to do, is we're holding something like Ales for Trails in tension with Eucharist. And there's a guy, A.J. Sherrill, who ironically was the pastor at Mars Hill, which is this massive church planted by Rob Bell, who was one of my heroes in my 20s. And I learned that A.J. Sherrill also just joined this kind of ancient faith church community. And I had a chance to talk with him on the phone about a month ago. And more or less the conversation was like, why did you do this? And he said this: I wanted to be connected to something alive and connected to history. And for me, that captured, I think, what we've experienced. He goes on to say, like, for a long time, I would find people that were alive, but it bugged me that they were completely detached from history. And then I'd find groups that were attached to history, but they tended to be pretty dead. And so I went looking for a group that could somehow do both those things. Which brings me back to the demoniac. Mark 5 was the passage that I preached the last time I ever spoke at Harvest, when our launch team was sent out. And what I wanted you to remember is, at the end of that reading, there's this interaction that this guy has with Jesus, and it's so counterintuitive. Because he says, hey, Jesus, let me go with you. And the answer to the question is always yes. And Jesus says, no. Like, yeah, but Jesus, there's like hundreds of people who follow you everywhere you go. And Jesus says, not you. You go back to the Decapolis. Well, Decapolis, it's a geographical designation. It's the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. There's 10 cities, Deca, hence Decapolis, 10 Greco-Roman cities that a good Jewish person was forbidden to visit. He says, go back there. Now fast forward in Mark to chapter 7, towards the very end. Then he returned. This is Jesus now. He returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. So we follow a rabbi who also goes to the Decapolis, and he's now back in the land that he sent this guy to. And Mark proceeds to tell a story about a time when 4,000 men and their families showed up to hear from this Jewish Messiah. In those days, when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, he called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd because they have been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And the question that comes up if you stare at it long enough is, what in the world happened that in this Greco-Roman culture that's as anti-Jewish as it can get, that there's 4,000 men and their families here to listen to a Jewish Messiah? What happened? And the answer is, this little-known demoniac was told by Jesus to go back to his everyday world and narrate a story. Just go do this. And in fact, if you keep peeling the layers, the Council of Nicaea was born from this region. So there's this long historical connection. And that's what we do. And this is what we learned. Like, we've said gather and scatter from day one. What I've since learned, is historic church practice. That's what you did. You gathered. And at the end of it, there's a commissioning. There's a get out of here. And it can be formal and it can be informal. But it's what? Come, be together, be strengthened, be refueled, have an encounter with the risen Christ, and then go back to the office, and back to the store, and back to the classroom, and back to the team, and back to your friend group, and back to the neighborhood, and show up in that space in a way that tells the story of a risen Savior. I'm going to pray. God, Thanks, Lord, for the way that you show up and that you invite us into this story that's ultimately your story to tell. And yet, for reasons that I suppose we won't understand till the other side of the veil, you just built into the whole thing is your desire for image bearers. And so, God, I pray for my friends who, beyond today, they go populate offices and neighborhoods and teams and classrooms and coffee shops and pizza shops and just scatter across our community, Jesus. And we all share this sense of unworthiness. We all share the experience of failing at the call, and yet we also share this commissioning to go tell your story. We love you, Lord.
If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org.
You can also look us up on Facebook or Instagram. Thanks for listening.